Thanks so much, Keely, for that very nice and way too long introduction. And as you know, sort of after an introduction like this, it can only go downhill. But I do want to tell you a little bit about behavioral science research into the diffusion and acceptance of climate change action. And many of you have seen the slide that I oftentimes put up and to motivate the research that I'm doing. As you know, we've been calling our time period the Anthropocene, to denote the fact that it's increasingly human behavior, and especially behavior with respect to energy, energy consumption, the type of energy that we use, that is influencing and shaping our physical environment. I guess one question we can always ask is, how well are we doing? And it turns out we're not doing so well to manage our future in sustainable ways. And I want to address 3 challenges that we face in order to make better decisions. Not necessarily maybe rational decisions in the economic sense, so that would be great too, but better decisions sort of in the long run. What are the challenges that prevent us from doing that? I think one of them is that decisions in the climate space involve intergenerational public good. So there are 2 components to that. The public good component in the first place, right, which is hard enough when we do it within our generations, but then also intergenerational. So that's point number 1. And I'll show you a study that explores why is it so hard, and also, which is a common component of my work, how we can improve on how we maybe present the decisions in ways that make the outcomes better. The second one I want to talk about is the influence of deep uncertainty. There's so much uncertainty about sort of the physical climate system, how people will respond to it, what technologies will be available for us when, how expensive they will be. They're huge sources of uncertainty, and oftentimes deep uncertainty in the sense that it's actually hard sort of now to resolve them, or even sort of down the future to resolve them. So we have to basically live with that uncertainty and make wise decisions in the face, in the presence of those uncertainties. And what's involved with that. And then the last thing I want to address is the need for collective action and coordinated collective action, and how to bring that about. And again, what are the factors that might prevent us from doing so, and how to overcome them. Okay. So the other point I want to make is that in those 3 studies I'm going to show you, or in that space in general, the transition from sort of how we are doing things now that are not so good in terms of outcomes, and how we might do things somewhat differently, maybe by sort of choice architecture broadly defined, by somehow representing choice options, or representing how we ask certain questions, or how we represent our physical or social environment in which we're making those questions. The transition from sort of now to maybe something better, I want to argue, involves variations in attention and variations in decision processes. And that gets to the point, or to the distinction between how policymakers oftentimes conceive of decisions, human decisions, in terms of rational choice, where sort of, we don't have to worry about attention because we have all the information, we know everything. There are no restrictions that limit our decision ability and agency. And also the assumption that we only make calculation-based decisions. The processes is one of rational choice. We think about outcomes, probabilities, time horizons, we discount, and then pick the one that maximizes our expected utility in some way or the other. And when I want to argue that that ain't so, we have limitations in our attentional capacity and in our processing capacity. We can only look at so much, and because we only look at so much, we look at a subset of factors. And we not only make decisions by calculating costs and benefits in some way. Sometimes we do so, and oftentimes we do so in sort of more limited way, not incorporating everything. But in addition to that, we also make decisions based on our feelings. Keely already talked about the fact that sort of risk oftentimes is a feeling, a worry that gets us to act. And we make decisions based on sort of following rules, rules of conduct. They might be moral and ethical rules of conduct. As a Christian, I do this. As a Buddhist, I do that. As a parent, I do that. As a teacher, I do that. Or there might be standard operating procedures that sort of are part and parcel of our professional education. As a doctor, the Hippocratic Oath. Or there might be sort of the kinds of things that others around us are doing, perhaps those that have more information in the space of uncertainty. So I follow what a respected alpha person in my space is doing, and chances are that will get us to something better than we can do ourselves with our limited knowledge and capacity. And so given that we have, in some sense, sort of slack in the system, we can focus on this or that, or we can make decisions with this process or some other process. Let's maybe sort of look at situations that involve these three sources of difficulty, collective action, deep uncertainty, and so on. And let's see how people naturally seem to be doing that in those contexts. And then think about ways of reorganizing, re-engineering the process a little bit to get us to something that might be better in the large scheme of things. And so this is something that has been investigated, of course, for a number of years now, for something like 40 or 50 years, in an area called behavioral decision research. And we can sort of start with prospect theory. Let me just sort of ask, show of hands, how many of you know what prospect theory is? Okay, worth talking about. So it's basically a psychological band-aid on something called expected utility theory. So how many of you know what expected utility theory is? Okay, a little bit better. So microecon hasn't quite kicked in yet. So it's basically expected utility theory is a normative model how to make decisions under risk and uncertainty. You basically figure out what are the probabilities, what are the outcomes. You sort of discount or you value the outcomes in appropriate ways. Risk averse, risk seeking, risk neutral, and then you sort of multiply outcomes by probabilities. You add them all up, and you pick the option that has the highest expected utility. That's great, but turns out that in many contexts, people don't always seem to follow sort of expected utility theory consistently. So it looks like in one situation, they look risk averse, in another situation, they look risk seeking, and psychologists have looked at sort of what accounts for these deviations from what the normative economic model would predict. And it turns out it has a lot to do with reference points. And so like how good $10,000 is depends on what you were expecting. If you were expecting to get $1 million, then $10,000 is a loss, a huge loss. If you're expecting nothing, $10,000 is a great amount. That's what prospect theory, or part of prospect theory, describes. And of course, that is related to attention. Attention means in any situation, there are multiple reference points. And the question is, which reference point do you sort of focus on and therefore make your decision on? That's one body of theory. Another one is called query theory, and I won't even ask you for a show of hands because I can guarantee you fewer of you have heard about query theory than the other two. But it's a psychological process way that myself and Eric Johnson developed over the last 15 years or so that explains why we see some of the phenomena that you see in prospect theory. Why, for example, we see loss aversion. And it has to do with the fact that when you make a decision, you basically, let's say, do you want $50 right away or $75 in 3 months' time? You ask yourself, okay, what's good about option A? What's good about option B? If there's more evidence for option B, you go with option B. The scale comes down in its favor, you choose it. That's great. Turns out that we can only sort of think about one thing at a time. This gets back to being limited information processors. And so if you look at the image on the bottom right of the slide, some of you will see two children looking at each other. The black is the foreground. Some of you will see a candlestick. The white is the foreground. You can actually switch back and forth now that you know it between those two images, but you can't really see them both at the same time. And so the same argument applies for decision or thinking about choice options. We think about one or the other. We might switch back and forth, but we only sort of focus on one at a time. So far, so good. But turns out that when you think about the first option, what's good about option A, you temporarily inhibit all arguments for all other choice options, for all other choice competitors, because you first want to find out, okay, what's good about A? Completely unconscious. It's just like a query to sort of your distributed memory about sort of past experience with these options. Then as you then a split second later turn to what's good about option B, those arguments, because they were just temporarily inhibited, have a harder time coming to the surface. Yeah? So lots of research on showing that all other things being equal, whatever you look at first to think, okay, should I choose this one? That has a small advantage, but a small but sizable advantage. Yeah? That's query theory in a nutshell. And so the million-dollar question is, what option do people consider first? Also, we sort of know that there's a lot of status quo bias in the world, and both prospect theory and query theory actually explain why there's so much status quo bias. In fact, I'm always surprised when people actually change what they're doing. Yeah, that's in some sense a more interesting thing to explain. From prospect theory, it comes as a function of loss aversion. We feel about twice as bad about losing something that we have than about gaining something that we don't have feels good. Yeah. And that's not a good recipe for change, right? That means that the new thing has to be at least twice as good or better, than the thing we're giving up on. Also, I think social norms actually sort of help us focus attention. Yeah, if the norm is everybody else is doing A, everybody else is choosing A, you will probably start out by saying, okay, what's good about option A? Yeah? Or you might sort of focus attention first on A, or A becomes the reference point. Turns out that sort of this variation in attention, the decision processes as part and parcel of our physical and our social environment is still sort of under-theorized and understudied. And as I want to argue, it has lots of implications for how we frame and how we communicate climate action. And I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so let's jump into those three studies. And let me acknowledge my co-authors on all of them. Yeah, not all its work, and takes a village, takes lots of people to do these experiments, because we do a lot of them also sort of in different regions of the world, cross-culturally and so on. This particular is a set of authors I got to know through the IPCC process, now the working group 3 in the 5th assessment report, and then have started to work with them since then. Valentina Bossetti is at Bocconi in Italy, and the other ones also are in various ways connected to them in Europe. And so this is an intergenerational public goods game I'm going to tell you about. So we know public goods game. Public goods game means that the option that you choose in terms of either contributing or taking away from a public good is something that is not in your best interest. You know, if you are indeed rational in the economic sense, you will free ride. You will not contribute to the public good, because in the end, you basically sort of get the average of whatever else gave. You know, so it's a recipe sort of for free riding in a way, and that's what economic games are. You know, they're basically stylized versions of phenomena we see in the real world, and of course, we see public goods dilemmas in lots of different contexts. You know, sort of not contributing to NPR, or sort of in this case, sort of basically sort of consuming whether it's clean air, or a climate system in ways that you may or may not contribute to in other ways. And so how do we, in normal situations, in intragenerational public goods games, how do we get around the free riding? Well, there are all sorts of ways in which societies, culture has figured ways around it. Fortunately, we're not Homo economicus. First of all, we have other regarding preferences. But on top of that, also, we have figured out ways of punishing those who will free ride. Because many of the situations are not single games. In fact, you could argue no game is a single game, because you never know when you're going to find that person who you just screwed in this single shot game 5 years later on the other side of a table interviewing for a job. So we're very good at sort of keeping track of how people have treated us. Reputations, in some sense, are really sort of stamped on our foreheads. We're hardwired to keep track of reputations. So in intra-generation public good games, we basically figure out how to punish them directly or indirectly, sort of for free riding. Or we have communications. We actually negotiate. And so we figure out ways of rewarding people directly or indirectly for being cooperative. In addition to us also having cooperative sort of values and impulses. So how does this now translate to an intergenerational public goods game, which of course we have in the climate context, right? Right now we are consuming the, sort of the fuel that is going to make life miserable for people in the future. Our CO2 emissions right now are intergenerational. Well, for future generations, we don't have this indirect punishment mechanism, because the future can't punish us backwards. Maybe in science fiction we can think of interesting scenarios, but sort of the way we know physics right now, it doesn't work. And so there's a huge power asymmetry between the present and the future. So there's no direct, indirect reciprocity, there's no communication. And so then, in principle, according to the economic view, sustainability and contribution to this intergenerational public good games would have to depend on non-strategic motivations, for example, like altruism. And I won't even go into this, but altruism, of course, is a big can of worms. So does it exist? And is there pure altruism, or is it just reciprocal altruism, and so on? But that's what it would have to depend on, sort of in the economic view of things. Now, social efficiency, of course, argues for being beneficent, to basically sort of be good to the future, because that's the other feature of public goods games. When you contribute something, sort of the experimenter sort of doubles your contributions in some way in many contexts. And so the equivalent in the context of climate, of course, is that any action now is so much more effective than action later on. Procrastination really costs us hugely, and so we really ought to do things now because it is a lot cheaper to do it now, a lot better for humanity to do it now. So social efficiency argues for being beneficent, for contributing, for not free riding, and yet rational self-interest argues against it. And here's another component that's very salient in the intergenerational public goods game. So basically, it's a chain of events. So basically, you get dealt a card from the past, and that card is either beneficent or free riding. So the person from the past either screws you or contributes to your well-being. And then the question is, what will you do for the next generation? And that's the simplest sort of chain of events which we sort of replicate in this game. The fact that you find out what did the person before you do to you is very, very salient, right? And if the person is beneficent, you feel good, that puts you in a good mood, in a good state. You probably will contribute to the future as well, to basically reciprocate what the previous person did. And also, if they screwed you, chances are you say, well, they screwed me, I'll screw them. Or you might not even be, I screwed them, but they screwed me, I feel poor, I'm not going to contribute. And so this negative intergenerational reciprocity has been well established in lots of contexts. So what did we do? We basically had exactly this set of game. Previous generations changed, and this was for real, so the people actually sort of, one gave to the other, and had a choice of, did they get an endowment? As you can see in the top right side, in this particular person, they got a pot of 70 cents. That meant that the previous person actually did contribute, because they would get 50 cents from the experimenter, and then 10 cents from the previous person, which was doubled, which would be 70. So if they got 70, they knew the previous person contributed. And they found that out either for just about the previous person in the chain, or about 4 previous ones, to show them a bit of a history. Okay? That was between subjects. So some of them only saw 1, and some of them saw 4 previous ones. And then the question is, how much would they give to the next person? Nothing, or 10 cents. Okay? And they made that decision either right away, or they were asked before or afterwards whether or not they could tell us how many people after them would actually contribute to the public good. And so basically what they got before was information about the past, what happened with either n-1 or n-1 minus 2 minus 3 minus 4. And then the next question was, well, in the future, how many people will contribute sort of to the next person? And they were either rewarded for giving us that estimate, or it was just said, okay, just without any reward. So what happened as a function of sort of when they were asked this question before or after, and also what happened to them as a function of the previous recipients? Was there a high endowment that they received? The previous person did contribute to their well-being, or was it a low endowment? So let's look at the slide, the high endowment slide. And as you can see, basically there, something like over 70% actually contributed to the next generation. Yeah? Those were the people who had received an endowment from the previous one. It didn't really matter so much whether it was just one, sort of, or four previous pieces of information. I won't say much about the information format here because it didn't have that much of an influence, whether they sort of saw one or four before. But also you can sort of see that being asked to also estimate how many people after them would contribute, the forecast before or the forecast after, whether they made that right before their decision or whether they made that estimate after they made their decision, didn't matter so much. They basically sort of, they felt good about having gotten the money, and they like 3/4 of them gave money as well. And it also didn't matter so much whether or not the forecast was incentivized or not. Economists have this big thing about sort of, so people are not going to be accurate or sort of, unless you pay them for it. Well, it turns out it doesn't matter whether you pay them for it. In fact, in the other condition, they're more likely to contribute if you didn't pay them for it. But it's not significantly different. But now let's look at the bars on the left when they actually did not receive an endowment from the previous person. So in the red bar, when they make the decision right away, after they find out that information, contributions go down to something like 40-some. So from 70-some to 40-some percent only contribute. So much less beneficial, much less contributing to the public good. But now when they made the decision for their own contribution, not right after they found out about that they were screwed, but after they now made that intermediary judgment about how many people in the future will contribute, which in some sense takes their focus of attention from what happened in the past now towards the future, because sort of how many people will contribute to the future, that's in part influenced by the fact that sort of it's actually good to contribute to the future because the experimenter doubles the money, and it does have positive consequences for the future. As you can see, huge increase in contributions, and it doesn't matter whether the estimate is incentivized or not, but it goes from 40-some to 60-some percent. And not quite up to the level of the one on the right-hand side, but very much so. So that suggests, well, first of all, the results in general suggest that there is some evidence of altruism, right, or the effect of social efficiency, because otherwise nobody would be contributing. If everybody was rational, all those bars would be down at zero, right? It wouldn't matter. So there are lots of sort of general motivations going on, but on top of that, also switching the focus on one where you focus on the past, which has really bad consequences, emotional consequences when you were screwed by the past, to a focus that is on the future before you make your own decision, has important and sizable consequences. Okay, let's move on to deep uncertainty. And there again, let me sort of acknowledge my co-authors. Two of them postdocs with me, Sarah Constantini and Alicia Cooperman, and also, of course, our very own Bob Cohen. So there we were interested in how people deal with sort of deep uncertainty, both in the context of COVID, sort of when you make a decision to go to that party, you don't really know, sort of, is this going to be a good decision or bad decision? And in the context of climate change, when you decide on some sort of climate action, whether it's personal behavior or policy endorsement, you don't really know, in some sense, sort of what are the consequences of that. And so then the question is, how do we deal with deep uncertainty in these contexts? And I already mentioned one of them, that we sort of do so by social imitation. We adopt the beliefs or the attitudes or the actions of trusted others. We follow social norms, injunctive social norms. You should be doing this, or descriptive social norms. Everybody else is doing that. And that is a good way of dealing with uncertainty. It makes, however, for partisan responses, because trusted others and respected others is not homogeneous across the population. And so when it comes to both COVID and climate change, if you are a Republican, chances are sort of your political leaders are telling you this is all bullshit, doesn't exist, it's not something to worry about. In fact, it might be something that sort of you should actively disendorse because it's deep state trying to get your money. Whereas if you're a Democrat, you have very different attitudes. So it makes for partisan responses, this mode of dealing with uncertainty, and political polarization. So what are some of the other ways in which we deal with deep uncertainty? Well, we oftentimes rely on our immediate personal experiences. Yeah? So there's evidence coming out of sort of the UK and other parts of the world that when people get affected by flooding of the houses, surrounding areas, and they attribute that to climate change, they actually sort of are much more willing to endorse policy proposals that deal with climate change, either in terms of adaptation and mitigation. It's also something called the local warming effect. If you ask people about their beliefs about climate change or their worry about climate change or their action to contribute to climate change in terms of a donation, on a day that's much hotter than usual, yeah, they're much more likely, they basically are like 1 or 2 points higher on all these scales. It's crazy, right? Because that one day hotter than usual is not diagnostic in any way. It's a little bit like asking somebody, what's the GDP of your country, and you look into your wallet and see how much money you have. When we still had money in our wallets, yeah. But yeah, in some sense, the statistics are so much more diagnostic, yeah, and probative about these questions. But what we feel and experience and see with our own eyes has a lot of value. Yeah. Hannah Arendt talked about sort of personal experience as isolated islands of certainty in an ocean of uncertainty. And this idea of seeing is believing is very prevalent. Yeah? And people can deal with what they see either in a rational fashion, so take that into consideration in terms of facts, or in terms of emotions. If you experience something that's worrisome, you're more worried, and the worry drives the action. And it's, again, not a bad way of dealing with deep uncertainty, but it does make for responses that are reactive rather than proactive, right? Because you first have to get the feedback about the negative experience. It has to be bad enough that you personally feel it before you start acting. And yet we know in many situations it would be better if we did it ahead of time, partly because of the procrastination penalty that we have, and partly we don't want people to get hurt necessarily before they start doing things that protect them from getting hurt. So what did we do in the study? Well, this was money from NSF that we got right after the onset of COVID, and we basically could follow a representative sample of Americans along in time, sort of a new survey every few months. And so we started in April of 2020, and then have been following up until actually earlier this year, and sort of balanced on sort of general population characteristics. And then the question is, like, who takes action on climate change, CC, or COVID-19, CV? And one thing that we find that the taking action is very much mediated by personal worry. How worried are you about basically sort of negative things happening to you as a function of these societal hazards? And true for both hazards. Blue is COVID, and red one is climate change. And we measured importance to act in different ways. It doesn't matter, how you do it or actual actions. You get this positive slope. So the more you worry, the more you do, or the more you endorse action. Yeah, not surprising in a way, but very much related to this body of research I've been doing as risk as feelings. Risk as statistics might be something we get in our professional context, and it's a way of sort of quantifying certain things like morbidity, mortality, accidents rates, and so on. But statistics don't necessarily move people to action. It's this warning signal that's bred into our bones that says something is not right, let me do something about it. And now then the question is, well, what predicts worry? And you don't need any statistical test to see that, yes, it is political ideology. So that is very much sort of the first mode of how we react to deep uncertainty. We basically sort of follow what respected people in our political party, in our religious affiliation, in whatever, in our professional identity sort of tell us is the right action. And in this case, first of all, this was the second wave. This was in August of 2020. There was much more concern about COVID than about climate change. This is on a scale from 1 to 4. But also huge gaps, differences in political party affiliation, with the Republicans being worried least and Democrats worried most. But then the question is, well, what happens now as people from all walks of life, from all political parties, experience negative consequences? And again, so you can measure negative consequences in different ways, in terms of COVID, health, and somebody dying or experiencing, getting really sick in yourself or in your family. or close circle of friends. In the case of climate change, basically experiencing extreme weather events, whether it's forest fires or flooding, or hurricanes and so on. As you see on the left-hand side, with having no negative experience, your perceived worry is a lot lower than on the right-hand side, where it is a lot higher. So positive increases, linear increases for both hazards. Now, if we now break this down about who is experiencing them as a function of their political party affiliation, you see that it's the Republicans who have the steepest increase in worry, from having no negative experience to having a lot of negative experience, probably in part because it goes so contrary to the expectations. Here's something that we were told is bullshit, and all of a sudden, sort of your brother dies of it. And lots of learning theories tell us that the more surprising something is, the more impact it has in terms of learning and changing our behavior in response to that hazard. And so as you can see on the left-hand side, at the low level, no negative personal experience, we see the polarization, the big gaps in worry. But at the right-hand side, for both hazards, on the left, climate change, on the right, COVID, those differences are drastically reduced or even sometimes sort of gone away. So again, what that seems to suggest is that personal experience as a channel or as a mode of dealing with deep uncertainty seems to dominate sort of the ideology and sort of coupling other people. That sort of, that in some sense it's a more powerful channel, probably because it's more relevant to you and you experience the consequences so directly. But it seems to dominate in the sense that sort of it can override the polarization that we see based on imitating the behavior of others. Now, of course, the downside, of course, is that the people on the right-hand side, there aren't that many people on the right-hand side. And so, sort of the negative consequences of both of those hazards were relatively, thank God, but relatively infrequent. But they do have an impact when they do happen. Well, I also should say it's not just for worry, but it's also for sort of willingness to pay for policy support. So we had this sort of built-in little experiment in our survey where they're being told that sort of global warming, climate change is affecting some more than others. And so should we include compensation for communities hardest hit by that? And with something similar for COVID. But let's look at climate change. And then we varied how much they would have to pay for endorsing this policy option, between sort of nothing up to $100 a month. If you now sort of look at people's expressed support, this goes from, I think, 1 to 5 is a scale. But for the Democrats on the left-hand side, first of all, I should say, the more you have to pay for it, the less are you willing to endorse it, which makes sense. That's what economists would predict, that sort of downward slope. And for the Democrats, personal experience being high, which is the blue, the maximum points, and being low, does have a difference in willingness to pay, but it's much, much stronger for the Republicans on the right. So that's consistent with sort of negative experience have a larger impact on people whose prior was that this was not something that was worth supporting or worth worrying about. Okay, let's move on to the third category of difficulty, coordination in collective action. And so now we're moving from decisions under risk and uncertainty to game theory, decisions against an intelligent other or with an intelligent other. So coordination games is sort of how economists think about sort of whether people are willing and able to coordinate on some action that is sort of beneficial to them. And as you know, economists have payoff matrices when it comes to game theory. And so here we have like groups of 10 people that we selected online. And my courses on this are a group of researchers out of Switzerland, and again, Sarah Constantino. And so we have groups of people that we pre-select based on their political ideology. So they're either 10 Democrats, self-described Democrats, or 10 self-described Republicans. And then over a series of rounds, we randomly pair 1 and 1 from that group with each other. They don't know who they are, but they know they come from that group of 10. This is done online, so it's anonymous. And they don't know that they're homogeneous groups on political. They know nothing about the other players. But they do know their payoff matrix. And so they know that when they, as you see on the pink area, take the payoff matrix on the very left. Before our intervention, basically, we are incentivizing them to pick the same option. So they basically are shown two options, and they can pick one or the other. If they both pick the same option, they get 200 points. If one of them picks one and the other one picks the other one, they only get 50 points. Okay? And so that's why it's called a coordination game. You do better when you figure out what the other person is going to do. Now, in the first round, you have no idea. You just do it randomly, right? But then we give them feedback. We give them feedback on which option did most people in that group of 10 pick, or not most people. We tell them how many people picked option A and option B, among the 10. We also tell them what their immediate other person against whom they played got and how many points they got. And so they basically learn how many people play each option over time. And they learn and of course they know how much they got because they have their payoff matrix, but they also find out how many points did the other person get. And so then they play this for a number of rounds. Here's one other difference in how we treat people. Well, let me actually first of all talk about the treatment. Then sort of after they so people do learn, as you can imagine. Sort of you first pick randomly, but then you sort of say, well, I guess I should have picked the other option because most of the people picked the other one. So then you go to the other one and you hope that not everybody switches at the same time. But after a while, sort of there's an equilibrium. After we gave them 20 rounds to figure out what to do, or we stopped when 90% of them actually had coordinated. People learn this. People can learn this quickly. So then after 20 rounds, or whenever they reached this equilibrium, they had a status quo, which was either one or the other of the two options, which then we sort of basically incentivized half of them to switch to the other option. So as you see at the bottom, the treated group, the one in the middle, basically half of them were now getting 350 points, sort of for the other option, no matter what the other side did. So they were basically, it's a little bit like providing people with some subsidy for electric cars. It doesn't matter. So what happens is some insurance policy. You're going to get a lot of money by going to this other option. You would be stupid not to switch to that other option because you do so much better, many points better by going to this other option. The question is, what do the other 50% of the people who are now playing with these people who are incentivized to switch, what will they do? Do they catch up that now there's a regime change? We're no longer dealing with this old status quo that got you most points, but now to get more points, you really should be switching to the other option. And how long does it take them to get there, and do they stay there? Here's the other intervention. The options were either labeled completely neutrally with just a hashtag and this @ sign, and so there was sort of nothing emotionally involving in one or the other, or with basically sort of two symbols that either showed Biden sort of riding on Trump, or Trump riding on Biden. This was actually done right before the last election, the 2020 election, So then the question was, did this sort of identity frame or this neutral frame, did that change sort of how the groups acted? So let's look at the results on the right-hand side. In the figure, the results on the left are what happened pre-intervention. And for the neutral group, let's look at the neutral group first. You saw the typical result that it takes a while for people to get to the status quo, where everybody picks the same option, but they sort of gradually get there. But it takes a while. It takes them the 20 rounds to sort of to reliably get there, to earn the 200 points that they were earning if they both did the same thing, on average. And then afterwards, when the half of the people were treated in the neutral condition, it took them a while to switch. But again, sort of, basically, sort of after a while, they sort of caught on. So people were getting the feedback and using the feedback in ways that allowed them to get to the maximum number of points, to get to a new equilibrium. What about the people on the bottom, the identity condition? And keep in mind, these were people sort of who, unbeknownst to them, all came from the same political party. First of all, they settled on a status quo option very, very quickly. It didn't take them 20 rounds. They sort of were there up, sort of very close to sort of optimality from round one, because they picked the first option. They didn't pick randomly. They picked the one that they liked, as a function of who they were, as their personal identity. And so then they basically had sort of settled on that as a status quo. And now they should have switched, right? Because half of them were incentivized to switch. to the other one by the points. But they were, of course, obviously disincentivized to click on this very highly distasteful other icon, right? And as you can see, basically they never reached the same level. There was some increase, but the increase is mostly almost completely due to the people who were incentivized by points. Yeah? But the ones who didn't actually get the higher points, they never switched away from that. So let me summarize. So I think what I wanted to show you is that attentional and decision processes are involved in these three different experiments that address three very different obstacles towards climate action, to more foresightful behavior regarding the future. And in the intergenerational public goods game, we saw that sort of the normal thing, sort of in an intergenerational context, is to sort of focus on what happened to you. Yeah? And if that's good, that bodes well for cooperation for the future. But if it's bad, and chances are it is bad, if economists are right, it should always be bad, right? Because we should not contribute to future generations out of self-interest. That has negative consequences. Now, can we sort of break that focus on the past in some way? And what that experiment was designed to show you is that we can by some intervention, in our case, sort of asking people to estimate how many people would contribute in the future, we could switch their focus to the future, and that actually helped quite a bit, from 40-some% to 60-some%, to counteract the negative impact of intergenerational negative reciprocity. Mm-hmm. When it comes to deep uncertainty, we basically found that the decision to act or don't act, to endorse a policy or to sort of do something personal about climate change, was driven by both norms, by their identity, by imitating so what respected people in their group were doing, and by a personal experience, but in such a way that personal experience actually prevailed in the showdown. Mm-hmm. And so the natural attention might be sort of first think about what should I do as a function of what other people are doing. And so if I'm a Republican, I first think about what argues for not acting, or what argues for not believing this is a problem. But if you're a Democrat, you might sort of start out by saying, okay, what argues for doing something about this or being worried about this? And that makes a difference. But personal experience then sort of shifts the frame, shifts the first query of the Republicans from first thinking about what's terrible about this, what's unbelievable about this, to say, let me think about maybe I should be doing something about this, what argues for after all doing something about this. And then in the last study, when we looked at coordinated collective action, again, the question that respondents had to ask themselves, after the treatment, and after they realized that their current status quo was no longer getting them the payoff they were expecting, they had to say, well, should I switch away from that? Should I do the other thing? Or should I stick with this because maybe this was just a fluke? In the next one, everything will be fine again. And again, sort of, if you first think about should I switch, you're more likely to switch than if you say, well, should I stay? And as we found that sort of that decision seemed to be driven both by economic incentives, because the people who actually did get economically incented for switching were more likely to switch. But not all of them, I should say. There were some that even sort of sacrificed points, for sure sacrificing points because they knew how much they were sacrificing. But also the other ones and didn't necessarily believe the data. And they did so out of identity concerns and social rewards, which, as we know, sort of are currency in their own right. And so what I want to argue is query theory processes are parsimonious explanations in all of these three studies. It's not the only thing that's going on. It hardly ever is in behavioral science experiments. There are oftentimes like 3 or 4 or 5 different reasons for why something might be going in one direction or the other ones. Sometimes they work in the same direction, sometimes they work in opposite directions. But I want to argue that sort of attentional focus and the query theory advantage that comes with focusing first on one option, action or non-action, switching or non-switching, cooperating or defecting, plays a large role. So in terms of communication takeaways, is an information deficit versus a cognitive or motivational deficit. I think the studies showed you that there is an attentional, cognitive, motivational deficit, in the sense that our attentional focus, might be wrong attentional focus might lead to a lack of climate action. Again, sort of, we already talked about this a little bit, sort of how that was happening in 3 different contexts. But that sort of the interventions that you saw in those studies, or other interventions that do something similar, that focus people's attention away from the past onto the future, or focus them from sort of positive, sort of beliefs about the future away from negative beliefs about the future. The right kind of labels, the right kind of images that invokes the right kind of social identity, sort of can go a long way to sort of, in a given context, sort of significantly change the likelihood that you do one thing or the other. Are there informational deficits, and if so, on what? Of course, there are almost informational deficits, but I think I want to argue in this case it's probably not necessarily on climate change. Most of us actually at this point believe there's climate change, but on climate action. The most effective and possible and feasible personal policy actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are not necessarily known by most people. So if you want to communicate something about climate change, that's probably the right way to go. But also make sure that whatever you communicate, to do it in ways that maximizes, sort of people's attentional focus, on the right kind of option first, or the right kind of reference point, if you want to sort of take a look at prospect theory. So with this, I thank you for your scarce attention, and I think we're ready for some questions, and there's some references to the studies we talked about. Dennis.
Thank you for that fascinating talk and demonstrating how critical psychology is in making progress on greenhouse gas mitigation. My question relates to the section on deep uncertainty, because as you point out, there is no longer deep uncertainty on the science. Mm-hmm. Climate change science is robust, and recent IPCC says, almost virtually 100% certainty we know anthropogenic emissions are changing the climate, and all sorts of catastrophic outcomes will result. Mm-hmm. So when you're discussing deep uncertainty, is it a perception of deep uncertainty among certain groups of the population? And if that's what you intend to mean, then is the question, how do we educate them, persuade them, have them act in their own self-interest, or how do you, how do you reconcile that?
So no, I wasn't thinking so much of deep uncertainty being a psychological construct, but even within the climate sciences, we know that we should act on climate change and climate change. But the question is, how catastrophic will it be? There's still, we still have sort of huge error bounds around. Well, they're going down a little bit, but okay, I'll give you the climate science, but sort of let's think about climate action. So we have to basically figure out what technologies will come online when. And we know we have to do something about climate capture, carbon capture usage and sequestration, right? And we have some sort of demonstration projects, and sort of Iceland and Sweden are leading the way and showing us how to do it with air capture. But there's still huge uncertainties. What's going to happen with nuclear? We don't really know. What sort of fusion? When will we have fusion? Maybe things have sped up. So there's still many areas where we really don't know a lot, and that's why sort of basically the best policy approach is probably not to put your eggs in one basket, in terms of technologies, to develop these things in parallel, to use and also to use a wedge approach, sort of in both within technologies but also across different types of solutions. So I do think there are uncertainties and even deep uncertainty, and of course then also human response, so carbon capture, we can have demonstration projects, but will people find this actually sort of acceptable, or will they sort of show the response that we had in the 1960s and 70s with respect to nuclear power as a source of electricity generation, where the engineers were telling us, yes, so much safer than coal-generated power in terms of morbidity and mortality of miners and so on. But the public the public thought that nuclear power was hugely more risky. And so I think that is a part.
So when you're saying deep uncertainty, then you're thinking in part about mitigation.
Mitigation, yeah.
The relative cost of the different mitigation
options, right, yeah.
The visibility of it and the perception of risk associated.
Yeah, no, thanks for that clarification. I think that helps a lot. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you brought up the examples of climate action and taking action to prevent COVID. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether people's decision-making processes in those two cases might be different because of the nature of the type of action you take and how directly connected it is to the probable effect or sort of the effect on risk. COVID is so much more immediate.
Sure. I mean, and you already put your finger on one important difference is, the uncertainty lasts 4 or 5 days to find out whether you should have not gone to that party, right? And you will find out. Whereas in the case of climate change, what we do, whether we vote in this carbon tax, or do something else, in some sense we never find out whether that made any difference, and so I think it's like an order of magnitude larger, which is why initially people thought that COVID was going to teach us, how to deal with climate change. Turns out we didn't do so well. Even in the case of COVID, which in some sense would seem like a no-brainer in a way. And I think also the other point that you put your finger on very nicely is that the actions are oftentimes very different. Like in the case of COVID, we're protecting ourselves and others, right? And there's some actions that only protect us, and actions that only protect others, and we can look to what extent people are more endorsing one or the other. And that's a little bit the parallel in climate change is adaptation versus mitigation, And we do find that there are oftentimes, meaningful differences in what people endorse in terms of adaptation, mitigation, or compensation, as a third category. That very much depends on who they are and how they think about it. So there are many refinements I could have focused on more, but I wanted to take more of a 10,000 meter view on things and show the combination of results.
Sort of two questions. The first is how, in query theory or in general, do you deal with the number of decisions that people would have to take, or the number of options, basically between a binary option and some kind of continuous spectrum? So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, do you have any thoughts on how, if people do take action, but those actions don't produce anything meaningful, they're maybe more resistant to, in the future, again, take that kind of action.
So the first one was?
The number.
Oh, yeah, number. Oh, yeah. So turns out it doesn't matter. And so the important thing in terms of query theory is, what do people look at first? And that first thing inhibits arguments for all the other ones. And then afterwards, it doesn't really matter whether you looked at one or then one or two or three and then come back to one. So it's the most important phenomenon is what you focus on first. That makes, in some sense, things easier, because that's, and also, that's what attention is all about, right? Does it look at go here or go there? And we know what people look at first in the lab, for example, by eye movement, recordings, and so you can actually verify that. What we do in many of the other studies, we ask people to list out loud what goes through their mind as they make these decisions, because in the lab, eye movements are good in the lab. It's not so easy to do it, remotely. But the thought listings, which we assume are a conscious but random sample of all the things that go through your mind, and it seems to generalize the results that we see in the lab when we do have the eye movement evidence as well. So that was the first one. So it doesn't matter how many other ones. What's the most important thing is what you look at first. And then the second one was?
If you take an action and you don't see any results.
So do you get rewarded for your action in some way? And
Yeah, exactly. Like for climate change, maybe you do something for a period of time and you say, okay, well, anyhow, nothing is changing. So what's the point? And then you're less likely. Right. This gets to the point that I made about that in any given situation, your behavior is determined by probably 4 or 5 or 6 different psychological processes. And what you're talking about right now is the reinforcement learning history, of this particular behavior. And we do know if you get rewarded for something, either in terms of material rewards, money or how many milligrams of orange juice, if you're a rat in a cage. It makes a difference, but there also are social rewards, And so it turns out that many actions are become much more prevalent and long-lasting if they become public. If it's a private act, and nobody knows you did this virtuous thing, it's okay. You do it because you feel good about yourself, the warm glow, or whatever it might be, because of your altruism, But if you do this and everybody knows you did something, like I voted, we give people stickers that I voted, So now I can pat you on the back and say, oh, I voted too, that's so nice, And so there's social reinforcement as well. So there are lots of currencies in which you get rewarded or not rewarded. And so, of course it makes a difference, but we can also think about ways of maybe making rewards more prevalent and maybe across different currencies that we have available.
So to kind of build on those questions for query theory, are there any effects for recency bias or things like that, wherever the last option is looked at in terms of ruling out potential reasonable solutions to climate change, does it matter what people look at last? And beyond just like what is first, should we care about the ordering as well beyond that?
So you're remembering your introduction to psychology, right? And primacy and recency effects, right? So this is something sort of that we teach in intro psychology, which has oftentimes to do with memory for lists, yeah? And so you give people a list of sort of 10 animals, and sort of one after the other, and then in the end you sort of say, okay, why don't you list all the animals that you can remember? And there's a primacy effect and there's a recency effect. The primacy and so that is a result of sort of us only having so many buffers in which we can sort of store information and rehearse information. So it turns out that there's a famous article, the magical number 5 plus or minus 2 by George Miller in 1956, yeah? Which is sort of why we actually have telephone numbers that are, what are they, 7 digits, right? And so 7 is something we can remember. If the list gets longer than 7, yeah, sort of, then basically you have to sort of bump out the early ones. Yeah? And so we have the recency effect, the primacy effect, because the buffer isn't full yet. So basically, we can fill up all 7 buffers that we have, yeah, and rehearse them actively before we have to start kicking things out. The recency effect is there because sort of the last items are in the buffer. They were never kicked out. Yeah? So it's a memory phenomenon and refers to sort of memory of things, yeah, not sort of the impact on a decision. And so this is like a long-winded answer, long-winded answer to your question that says, no, we don't get a recency effect in query theory, because what happens is, as you generate arguments for one or the other option, they accumulate in some sort of running average. Yeah? And whenever sort of you have an argument for it, that your counter goes up, and whenever you get something counter, it goes down. And when you cross a boundary, say, okay, now I have enough evidence, I'm going to go with that, in one direction or in the other direction. And so there's no recency effect. And we get the primacy effect not because of the memory phenomenon, but because sort of basically those arguments for the first option were never inhibited. And that's why it doesn't matter whether you have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 options. It's the fact that you're thinking about what's good about A, the first one, inhibits everything else. Yeah? Because you've all the response competitors, and there could be 1 competitor or 3 or 4 or 5 competitors.
Mm. Strikes me that that's similar to maybe the country level, where countries are more affected by climate change and push for more action at negotiations. Is there some sort of insight you can take from your study of individuals that is relevant to national negotiations at a COP?
Well, it seems there's so many reasons for why, when your country is underwater, you should be more concerned about it. You probably don't even need psychology for that. So, I mean, but your question is a really interesting one, sort of to what extent can we generalize phenomena at the individual level, to sort of meso, to group levels, or to even so macro levels, where the unit is a country. And I would think very carefully. And I think something that you definitely want to test, and typically, oftentimes you might find the same phenomena, but the phenomena are driven by very different mechanisms, and processes. So I would be careful, yeah.
Doesn't that mean that there are a lot of low-hanging fruits in terms of changing individual behaviors towards, let's say, more environmentally favorable behaviors, in terms of changing the default option in many daily things? So yeah, I've been thinking about that I mean, it seems obvious that yes, there are low-hanging fruits in that direction, but then how does that interact? How does the choice of default option interact with, let's say, more top-down processes or institutions which decide those default choices? So it can be anything, but for a company, it could be, for like a supermarket, it could be what product is close to the cashiers, or I don't know, something like this. And that's like favoring a default choice. Or at Frist, I'm trying to set up a position, by the way. At Frist, you get the disposable food first, the disposable container first. You have to ask explicitly for non-disposable. So that's like a default choice as well. That's when you don't care about the issue, you just take the default choice.
So
or the first thing that comes in.
So 4 or 5 really interesting questions all in one. So first of all, the first one sort of, are there low-hanging fruit because of this? The German have a proverb that says, your word in God's ear. The answer is yes. So I think sort of there's so many things we could be doing by default that sort of they don't sort of put the burden on people to figure out decisions in domains that really don't interest us that much. Yeah? Do I really care about my electricity bill? Not so much, not as much as I care about my kids, about my husband, about sort of my paper, whatever it might be. And so why not sort of make that option, the default option that seems to be clearly in the public good, sort of like, for example, sort of having the optimal level of renewable electricity, sort of for a given utility being the default option. You shouldn't have to sort of search for 20 minutes on some website to figure out what provider will get you green electricity, brown electricity basically being the default. And then when you make that final decision, like 6 months later, the contract is null and void and you have to start all over. That's crazy, right? And there's huge political consensus actually on green electricity. It's not even a controversial sort of political option. So yeah, so why not we make all the things that sort of are clearly good for the public and good individually for most people and are endorsed by them when they think about it, let's make those the default options. So why don't we? Well, because not everybody who sets default options has the public good in mind. So their vested interest, sort of who set default option that sort of benefits them rather than sort of the public good. And then there's the question is, then who decides on the default options? And do people mind being defaulted into something? Sort of because it takes away agency in a way. So I might not be so interested in electricity, but then when somebody says, "Oh, I'm going to make the decision for you," I say, "Go away, you paternalist. I make my own decisions," which makes me think, but why is paternalism a dirty word? We have parents for good reason, right? And we don't let kids sort of eat all the foods that they want. But the assumption is that adults, sort of have all the agency and all the knowledge, and so it's sort of taking away agency. Turns out, when you ask people whether or not they would like to have certain things delegated, so to defaults or other decision makers, that for most of the time, if they think that their decision maker, the choice architect, has their best interest in mind, they're all for it. But they also are wary of companies, or other interests, not having their best well-being in mind. And so there's opposition against something when you can't trust the choice architect. And that then suggests that you have to find choice architects, first of all, that are well-intended, because the tools, of course, are out there for anyone to use, for good or for not so good. But then the question is how to sort of set the right kind of institutions, the right kind of laws that sort of those bad assumptions of default agency sort of are not possible. So.
I think that's all we have time for, so thank you again.